Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cameron May, and I would like to welcome you all to the Department for Energy and Mining's information session on the Draft Hydrogen and Renewable Energy Bill. I'm a Principal Policy Officer within the Department for Energy and Mining, and I will be facilitating today's session. To begin today's proceedings, I would like to acknowledge that as guests here on Kaurna land, everything this department does impacts on Aboriginal country, the sea, the sky, and its people, and the spiritual and cultural connections which have existed since the first sunrise. Our responsibility is to share our collective knowledge, recognise a difficult history, respect the relationships made over time, and create a stronger future. We are ready to walk, learn, and work together. The Draft Hydrogen and Renewable Energy Bill was launched on the 11th of May and proposes a dedicated and streamlined one-windowed government framework for the development and regulation of hydrogen and renewable energy development in South Australia. Today is an opportunity to hear from key officials tasked with developing the Hydrogen Renewable Energy Act as they provide an update and explanation of the draft bill before moving to a question and answer session. Today's session will run for 1 hour with approximately 35 minutes dedicated to a presentation on the draft bill and 20 minutes for questions. Guests are encouraged to submit their questions for the panel through the live chat function throughout the presentation by selecting my name, Cameron May, in the chat and then sending through your questions. Joining me today is Alicia Green, Director of Strategy and Policy within the Growth and Low Carbon Division at the Department for Energy and Mining, Dominic Pepicelli, Principal Engineer within the Energy Resources Division at the Department for Energy and Mining, and Richard Day, Director of Industry Development at the Office of Hydrogen Power SA. To begin today's presentation, Richard will introduce the state's hydrogen and renewable energy journey and the need for this reform, before handing over to Alicia and Dom to explain the bill. Richard, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thanks, Cam. I think most people would hopefully be aware of South Australia's journey, but South Australia is a global leader in renewable energy transition. As a state, we've transformed our electricity system from 100% fossil fuel around 15 years ago to 70% renewables last calendar year. And all of that was wind and solar. The first quarter of this year, we were 70% renewables, so really breaking new ground. That really means we've gone through one of the fastest renewable energy transformations in the world. Other claims to fame are we've got the highest per capita rooftop solar in the world, and also the highest proportion of variable renewables, that wind and solar, in any gigawatt scale grid in the world as well. We regularly set sort of new records for either instantaneous, sort of daily or weekly, for the amount of wind and solar in our electricity system. And we're home to a range of global innovations. Most people will be aware of the Hornsdale Power Reserve, the world's first 100 megawatt battery. We're home to the world's largest home battery-based virtual power plant, and a whole host of other sort of firsts and innovations. But I guess we're now on the cusp of achieving net 100% renewables by 2030, and we are targeting net zero emissions as a state by 2050 and a 50% reduction by 2030. And I guess what we're seeing is really, we as a state, we sort of stand on the precipice of becoming a renewable energy superpower off the back of our world-class wind and solar resources, overlaid with, I guess, our mineral and agricultural resources as well. And you can see the map on the slide shows sort of an overlay of both the wind resources in sort of purple and green on the map, the solar in yellow. And the green is where you get that coincidental wind and solar resource. And that really is what gives us that competitive advantage in energy-intensive industries. And I think that's where we're seeing the state could undergo a really major sort of industrial transformation. And ultimately, it could see us becoming a producer of an exporter of products such as green iron, green steel, green methanol, synthetic methane, sustainable aviation fuels, green ammonia, green urea, green fertilizers, green copper, green graphite, green graphene, green lithium, green grain, green wine, so on and so forth. So, and I guess that sort of onshoring of energy-intensive industries, could potentially, would generate significant economic wealth for generations to come, as well as see us make a major dent in global carbon emissions by displacing emissions that occur in other regions and other nations. We did hold a forum in Port Augusta late last year, which brought together over 25 Aboriginal nations from across South Australia. And together these nations communicated that access to First Nations land for the purpose of renewable energy and hydrogen generation would be Aboriginal people's gift to the world to tackle climate change. And so that's a gift potentially that all South Australians may want to get behind as well. Now, the scale of potential infrastructure associated with this renewable energy superpower is significant, and we realise that this sort of gift is not possible without major legislative reform. It's become apparent that the current regulatory frameworks that we have are not fit for purpose for infrastructure deployment of this scale. I guess a couple of examples is the current coexistence provisions for wind on pastoral leases, which were legislated in 2014. They were based on a first-in, best-dressed model for wind farms of typically a few hundred megawatts. What we're now seeing is interest in developing multi-gigawatt scale wind farms in our pastoral zone, and we firmly believe that we need to move to a best-dressed first-in model to maximise the value for all South Australians, and includingly, and most importantly, our First Nations people, who hold not only native title over large swathes as the state, but are responsible for Aboriginal culture and heritage across all of South Australia. We're also seeing interest in the development of offshore wind farms in state waters, but we have no legislative framework in place to award sort of exclusive access to the seabed for developers. And we also believe that this should be on a best-dressed first-in basis, following a rigorous assessment of environmental considerations, as well as the impact on other users of the marine environment, such as fishing and shipping. And thirdly, a third example, we're also starting to see very large vertically integrated hydrogen projects being conceived. And again, under the current regulatory frameworks, they will need to seek a range of permits, licenses and approvals from multiple agencies in parallel. And we think that the new framework allows this to happen in a more coordinated, efficient and streamlined manner. Hence, really, the key driver behind the Act is to responsibly unlock the value of our renewable energy resources in an efficient and certain way for industry that meets the environmental, social and governance needs of investors, customers for the end products, as well as the South Australian community. So it is intended to be enabling legislation, and I guess we'll really, achieve two key things. It will provide a framework for awarding exclusive land access to renewable energy and hydrogen project developers on both pastoral land, in state waters and prescribed Crown land. And secondly, it will move to what we describe it as an industry-based regulatory model, perhaps as distinct from a functional-based regulatory model. And this is similar to what we have already in place for the mining, petroleum and geothermal sectors in South Australia. As a state, we're regularly regarded by the Fraser Institute as being in the top 10 jurisdictions in the world for its mining and petroleum regulatory frameworks. This is also known as a one window to government model, where the industry-facing regulator is responsible for land tenure and licensing and works with other regulators under a co-regulatory model. So other regulators such as the Environment Protection Agency or Safe Work SA. So the development of this Act is really drawn upon this world-leading experience in administering both mining and petroleum and geothermal energy acts. And I know from discussions with those in the renewables sector that have previously worked in those sectors, they immediately see the huge benefits of moving to this sort of model. I guess this is a genuine consultation. We do want to get this Act right before it is introduced into Parliament for debate. And we do want to hear from all stakeholders. So we do want to hear what you think. So certainly strongly encourage people to make their views known through this process. Now Alicia's and Dominica are the experts in the Act, so I'll now pass to Alicia to take us through the next stage.
Thanks, Richard. First up, I'd like to provide a short recap about the work that's led to the draft bill, especially for those that may not have participated in the consultation to date. So as Richard outlined really well, in South Australia, we're seeing a significant step change in renewable energy development ahead and development occurring in new parts of the state. And the current regulatory frameworks we have are not considered fit for purpose for what lies ahead. So we need to shift to a system of strategic, orderly, government-led development focused on pursuing shared benefit for all South Australians, while also ensuring South Australia is an attractive investment destination for developers and investors. We know that renewable energy generation is vital to achieving our decarbonisation ambitions. And as Richard mentioned, we have deep experience in regulating mining and petroleum industries. So we understand that secure tenure and community support are critical for successful projects and a successful industry statewide. So the government proposed the development of a fit-for-purpose, whole-of-life-cycle, streamlined regulatory framework for hydrogen and renewable energy generation using our leading one window to government approach. The government consulted on an issues paper to help shape the approach that the Hydrogen and Renewable Energy Act should take, and this was conducted from November in 22 through to February this year. The issues paper proposed key principles that would be central to the development of new legislation. Critical is the delivery of an efficient and flexible licensing and regulatory framework to facilitate development. We're also seeking to help investors demonstrate strong environment, social and governance credentials in a number of ways. Activities under this proposed legislation would support achievement of decarbonisation of our economy and community, and we've proposed to put working with Aboriginal people at the centre of the legislation. We know it's also important to protect biodiversity and ecosystems at the same time as we respond to climate change. And so one of the key principles was to deliver a net benefit to the environment, to recognise these other environmental priorities, and to ensure infrastructure can be recycled and doesn't contribute to landfill. We also propose to consider how the environmental benefit, how the development benefits local communities through partnerships, local employment, local business opportunities, decarbonisation of other economic sectors and energy security. And finally, we propose to support multiple and sequential land use outcomes. Now, this means that different industries can coexist on the same land at the same time, such as renewable energy, agriculture and mining, which is incredibly important for South Australia's economic diversity and prosperity going forward. So as I mentioned, consultation was conducted over a 3-month period from November to February. It included regional visits, an online webinar like this one, a series of online information, including the issues paper, as well as surveys and forums. The proposed approach was also tested with key investors in Japan and Korea. As Richard mentioned, the department hosted the first South Australian Aboriginal Renewable Energy Forum in November 2022, and then a follow-up forum to inform the draft bill in March 2023. We received 85 submissions from a wide variety of stakeholders, and we greatly appreciate the time taken by each person and organisation who wrote in or met with the team. The majority of submissions that we received generally supported the government's objectives and the key principles proposed to underpin the development of a framework. The one window to government approach was well regarded, particularly by those who have experienced this type of regulatory framework before in South Australia. We did hear concerns about the introduction of a licensing framework on freehold land in addition to processes under the Planning Act. We heard South Australia has a stronger focus on community, Aboriginal rights and multiple land use compared to other jurisdictions both within Australia and internationally. Most of the respondents advised that more detail was required to form a properly considered view on what was being proposed. So that's what we're providing now with the opportunity to provide feedback on this draft bill. If you'd like more information on the previous consultation process, a consultation report is now available on the ORSE website. So we're now consulting on a draft hydrogen and renewable energy bill, informed by the feedback that we received during the first stage of engagement. It seeks to streamline project and land use approvals in order to increase the state's renewable energy production and catalyse development of a new hydrogen sector. It provides a one window to government regulatory framework statewide, removing requirements for planning approvals. It also delivers competitive access to pre-identified areas of government-owned land, which are to be identified in close consultation with community and key stakeholders. And it also prescribes native title roles and engagement, ensuring that First Nations people's rights and interests will be considered early and throughout the regulatory processes. Okay, so a little bit more information on our one window to government approach. This approach is recognised nationally as leading practice, including through Productivity Commission reviews, with the Australian Productivity Commission previously describing it as a model for other jurisdictions to emulate. We are also recognised internationally for this model. This year again, South Australia has been recognised by the Independent Fraser Institute and the companies that contributed to the Institute's annual survey of mining companies. Our recently updated mining regulatory system and policy settings are ranked number 3 in the world and the best in Australia. The Department for Energy and Mining will provide one entry point to government for all licences, meaning a company only has to deal with one expert department, and that department helps them navigate through the rest. We've drawn on our extensive experience to inform the draft bill, focusing on outcomes-based regulation, providing opportunity for innovation and for the sector-based cost-effective approaches to managing impacts. Where impacts are standard, providing for standardised approaches, which reduces effort and provides more certainty. We'll provide an expert regulator with a dedicated service for the industry and coordinated and streamlined government approvals, delivering greater efficiency and reduced timelines. So the next part of our webinar will focus on explaining the key elements of the proposed regulatory process, from the identification of release areas on government-owned land, through to feasibility and infrastructure licences, hydrogen generation licences, environmental impact assessment and operating management plans. This diagram is available on our website if you'd like to access a copy following the webinar. So to start with, the objects of the Act that are proposed in this draft bill, they are consistent with the key principles that we outlined in the issues paper, which were supported through the consultation feedback we received. Establishment of an effective, efficient and flexible regulatory framework for large-scale renewable energy and hydrogen development is key, as is competition for access to areas of government-owned land. To ensure this sector can have long-term success and strong support from South Australians, the Act will facilitate economic prosperity and benefits for the state, net environmental benefits, public safety, engagement with Aboriginal people, community consultation, and a net zero carbon emission industry. So building on the proposal that was put forward in the issues paper and the feedback received, the bill proposes a new approach to development on government-owned pastoral land and state waters. This is turning around the usual approach to such matters, and we seek to identify and avoid or manage potential impacts earlier, build community support for projects, and de-risk projects for companies, making South Australia a great place to invest. Now, these are lands that have coexisting ownership by native title groups. So we're proposing that the government will work together with Aboriginal communities, pastoralists, industry, co-regulators to determine where we should be hosting projects, and clearly identifying very early on where projects should not be pursued due to other important land use and environmental sensitivity considerations, and conversely, the most appropriate places for renewable energy development. The regulatory framework will set out a process of multi-criteria analysis, identifying all of the matters that need to be considered and establishing a level of sensitivity that areas of land have to renewable energy development. This will include resource availability, environmental, cultural, heritage and social considerations, amongst others. And this will be supplemented by formal consultation with key stakeholders, so the people that have in-depth local and specialised knowledge and expertise. This will be the first and earliest opportunity to identify and then avoid or manage land use sensitivities. Access to lands proclaimed as a reserve, protected area or park under South Australian Conservation Acts will continue to be managed under those existing frameworks provided for under the Acts. The draft bill does not introduce a regulatory regime providing access to parks and reserves. The draft bill sets out the ministerial decision-making process for the declaration of release areas. It's proposed there will be a joint approval process by the minister administering this proposed act, and then depending on whether the area is in pastoral land or state waters, there will be joint approval with the Minister for the Pastoral Act or the Minister for the Harbours and Navigation Act. The process for area identification and for determining selection criteria to assess competitive applications against, and the terms and conditions that should apply to licences are proposed to be set out in the regulations. This will include formal consultation with stakeholders. It's proposed to be set up this way so that there is flexibility to ensure each release area process can be tailored to take into account the needs of each area with its own unique stakeholder groups and issues. The requirements of Heritage and Conservation Acts will still apply. The draft bill also proposes a process through which interested parties can request the Minister to consider the declaration of a release area. And this would be subject to due process, including the multi-criteria analysis and stakeholder consultation. I'd now like to hand over to Dom, who'll be taking us through the licensing, environmental impact assessment and operational management plan processes in the draft bill. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Alicia. As Alicia said, I'll be first going through the 3 key licenses that are proposed under this bill. The first being the Renewable Energy Feasibility Licence. So this is really the initial exploration licence that authorises exploration activities to assess the feasibility of exploiting a renewable energy resource. So those types of activities include things like meteorological mass, remote sensor operations, so your LiDAR and SODAR and those types of measurements, and also geotechnical investigation. And under the bill, there's also a power to include further activities in the regulations. So under this licence, this bill will enable a streamlined approvals process for these exploration activities. So this is proposed to be done through having standardised approaches to technical standards and also environmental assessments, where all companies can use these standards, and there will not be a need for repeated use, and efficiencies can be seen by moving straight towards the technical submission to the department. So there won't be a need for extended consultation or environmental assessments by the company. So the licence also grants exclusive right to a release area over designated land. So this is only on Crown land, which includes pastoral leases and state waters. It's proposed to have a 3-year licence term, and there's also options for extension from the Minister, most concerning force majeure type reasons. The licence size is to be determined by the Minister, subject to the release area process. So we heard a lot of the feedback from the initial consultation on the issues paper, and part of that was to allow flexibility in the licence size, especially for the early feasibility stage, where we still have some uncertainties to the size that will be required to narrow down these projects. And finally, native title agreements in the form of a ILUA, or Indigenous Land Use Agreement, is required over native title lands. So I want to touch quickly on the selection criteria that's required for renewable energy feasibility licenses. So these are licenses that are awarded after the release area process that Alicia talked us through. So as part of that release area process, there will be consultation with other departments and native title on the selection criteria that will be applied for a given release area. And those types of, we propose selection criteria such as the ones that are listed here, but they may be specific to the release area in question. So some of the criteria will include things like provision of a work program. So this will detail the nature and extent of operations, maximising understanding of the renewable energy resource, the proponent's operational, technical and financial capacity, and also their history and operation in Australia and in South Australia. Also, an applicant's demonstrable ability to negotiate with native title and other traditional landowners. And finally, a business model or plan of the applicant. Even though we're still at an early stage, we want to see where proponents see their projects moving forward, and especially how they bring in the state objectives and benefits to the South Australian economy. And renewable energy feasibility licence grants an automatic right for that proponent to apply for a renewable energy infrastructure licence, which is the next licence I'll discuss here. So the renewable energy infrastructure licence is the licence that allows the proponent to construct, install and operate renewable energy infrastructure. So it includes things like wind turbines, solar panels, also offshore wave and tidal turbines, and also incidental activities such as, or incidental infrastructure such as batteries and pumped hydro storage, where the primary purpose is storing renewable energy. These licenses grant exclusive right to undertake activities over designated land. So the right over freehold land is secured through an interest to the land. So these licenses over freehold land won't confer access to that land. That is all covered through acquiring the interest in that freehold land. So the licenses have a 40-year license term, and that's held by the operation of the infrastructure. And the license size is to be determined by the minister. Again, we heard a lot of feedback on having flexibility with the license size. The renewable energy infrastructure license will include a joint approval with the Minister for the Pastoral Act. So it'll be the Minister for the Hydrogen Renewable Energy Act and the Pastoral Act joint approving this license. And finally, as with renewable energy feasibility licenses, there'll be native title requirements for native title land, so in the form of an Indigenous land use agreement. So the final license I just wanted to discuss regarding these top three ones are the hydrogen generation licenses. So these licenses give a proponent the ability to construct, install, operate facilities to generate hydrogen specifically for a commercial purpose. So under this Act, we don't want to be covering small-scale hydrogen generation or research or testing facilities. So generating hydrogen under this Act means any form of the creation of hydrogen. So we want to be agnostic as to which form of hydrogen creation is applied, whether it be green hydrogen or blue hydrogen. So electrolysis of water or reformation of natural gas, all of that is captured under this Act. This license also includes incidental operations, so the storage of hydrogen at the surface in tanks, and also the transportation or processing of hydrogen is also covered. And furthermore, approval processes under the Hydrogen and Renewable Energy Act to ensure operations meet leading practice safety standards is a key focus of this Act. We want them to be the lead agency for hydrogen safety, and we want that to be a focus where we work cooperatively with other departments such as Safe Work SA. So these licenses exclude the operation of transmission pipelines. So if you're transporting hydrogen in a pipeline, then that is excluded, and also the storage of hydrogen in natural underground reservoirs. Both those exclusions are covered under the Petroleum and Geothermal Energy Act. So the hydrogen generation licence does not confer right to land, so a proponent must first acquire an interest in that land before applying and being awarded the hydrogen generation licence. Again, licence term and size to be determined by the Minister, and finally, as per the last two licences, native title agreements are required for native title lands. So these are some provisions that are applicable to all Hydrogen Renewable Energy Act licences. So firstly, in terms of data provision, we heard a lot of feedback again from the consultation on the issues paper. And while we are still requiring the submission of resource data collected in these licences, the government will hold this data confidentially until licence relinquishment, and the reason being the government wants to have that data if they decide to go out for release over that area again. Next is the decommissioning and rehabilitation requirements that are part of this Act, which is another key reason for the implementation of the regulatory approval process. We're taking a lot of the decisions and planning from the PDI Act process and applying it here, but having more of a continual compliance role in that. Next is the licence fees for service. So these are the fees that are required for the government to administer the Act and are relatively small for each licence. Next is the rent payable, and this is over designated land only. So to be clear, the designated land only covers government-owned land, so that's Crown land, pastoral land, and state waters. And the rent payable will be subject to further consultation. We're still having discussions internally and with other industry and landowners to ensure we're coming up with a fair and just model for rent. Next, we have the bond and security provisions. And again, we're consulting on this further, and we want this to be discretional for each project. So it's really just the power for the Minister to require a bond or security at this stage in the bill. Next, we have the dispute resolution and compensation provisions for other users of the land that might be overlying or underlying the licence. So licences such as pastoral or resource licences. So it's important we have a formal process there where the Minister can mediate in the interest of the state. Then we have that all licence applications when coming to government must provide a work program and also demonstrate their operational, technical and financial capability. And finally, there should be no surprise that if a licence fails to meet their work program, then the Minister will have powers to cancel that licence. So it's really to stop any land banking. I won't go through this too much. Alicia showed it earlier, but in terms of broadly speaking about this flow chart, it's really showing the approvals and licensing process, and it's broken down into 3 steps. So the first one is really the licensing process, which is the top, going to the right flow chart bit there. And then we have the next step, which is the environmental assessment step, which is the middle bit. And then finally, the activity approval step, which is the third bit. So in terms of going through the licensing stage, if on designated land, then we go through the competitive process, as Alicia went through, and we get to a joint ministerial decision. And once decided, that successful applicant will need to negotiate the ILUA over the land before the licence is granted. If it's over non-designated land, so freehold land, then it's simply gaining an interest in that land, then applying to the Minister, who will then grant the licence. So after the licence is granted, that's when a company can begin access agreements with other owners of the land. So it doesn't necessarily have to be straight away, but it can be sometime before the actual activities commence. and then they move into the environmental assessment process. And before that begins, there's an optional scoping stage to determine the requirements and the extent of those requirements. If the project is of complex nature, which might then require assessment under the EPBC Act. After that, then we have the preparation of the environmental impact report and the statement of environmental objectives. So the ER and SEO in that bubble there. So these are the two key documents which are specific to an activity and specific to a region. And they cover, in terms of the environmental impact report, it covers all the impacts that will be associated with that activity and in that region. So based on that environmental impact report, a statement of environmental objectives is then prepared, which details all the impacts that were found in that environmental impact report, how those impacts will then be managed, and the resultant objectives that must be achieved before activities can commence. So the powerful thing about the ER and SEO is this is where all of the departmental requirements, so not just the HRE Act, but all other acts, so the EPA, for example, the EPA Act, the EP Act, Landscapes Act, Safe Work FSA, all of the requirements from these other acts are all captured within this one document or within the Statement of Environmental Objectives. So there's one document that covers all the requirements under the license that the government must see before activities can commence. So it's one port of call. And so before we then consult on these documents, and before consulting, the licensee must then consult with government agencies under an approved consultation plan approved by the Department for Energy and Mining. And then they'd submit it to the department, and then the department goes for a mandatory 30-day public consultation. And once that consultation concludes, the comments are provided to the proponent, who must then adequately address them and then submit a revised environmental assessment documentation to the department, who then assesses it and if determines it to be to satisfy the comments, then approves the EIR and SEO. And then it moves forward with gazettal of the SEO. So that SEO document becomes an instrument under the regulation that can be used for the activity approval moving forward. So the next step after that, I'll go a bit more quickly through this because I think we're running a bit long. So the operational management plan is the next stage, which then is required to be submitted to the department to detail all the specific technical and activity-related information that must be submitted to the department before activities can commence. So this is where all of the relevant standards need to be referred to. And then the minister assesses this, and then assuming notice of entries are provided and the landowners are happy, approval is then provided by the department. So before I move on, an important step here is that whole section around environmental assessment can be waived if an SEO already exists for that activity. So if there's a gazetted SEO that exists for the activity and region, then any proponent may use that SEO and skip that environmental assessment part of the flowchart and move straight to the activity assessment where the operational management plan is submitted, and then approval is provided given the regulatory requirements are met. So these are the definitions of some of the reports in that flowchart. You can read it in your own time or pause the live feed at your will. So in terms of what's not licensed under the Act, we do not license non-commercial hydrogen projects, so those of research or demonstration nature. Domestic use of renewable energy, so no rooftop solar or anything like that is covered under this Act. The end use of hydrogen, so petrochemical facilities, hydrogen refueling stations won't be covered under this Act either. and there's also regulatory powers to make exclusions also. Finally, I want to touch on the special enterprise license, which is the final license type here, which is a license type that will only be provided when there is a major state significant project. And this license confers access to the land, and it's over both government-owned land and freehold land. And so this license does not compulsory acquire land. It is intended to be a non-consensual grant of a license on top of that land. So all rights coincident with that land, so native title rights, or if there are pastoral leases or mineral tenements, they all continue to exist. And they're all subject to the processes under the HRE Act for compensation and things like that. So it's applicable to all land, as I mentioned, and it needs to be an agreement between the minister and the proponent before it can be granted, and that would detail access conditions and compensation requirements. And there's also prescribed consultation as part of before the grant of this special enterprise license. And finally, activities licensed by an SEL are still subject to all the approval processes under the HRE Act. And this is my last slide. So on transitional provisions, this is an important aspect that we are still going through the consultation and determining the final details, in particular with industry. So we welcome your feedback on what we propose so far. So in terms of the overarching principle, we really want to avoid any unnecessary duplication or unnecessary costs to the current renewable energy and hydrogen proponents. So the proposal as it stands is that any existing development approvals, we want those to continue to remain lawful under the PDI Act. So effectively they are grandfathered. And in terms of development applications that are in progress, we propose to have rights to continue those assessments under the PDI Act at the discretion of the proponent. Assessments under the HRE Act that intend, so if there are any assessments that then move to the HRE Act, we intend that there is no further work required than what would already be undertaken as part of a proponent's normal due diligence for good operation of carrying out activities of that project. So we don't want to be asking for anything that's over and above what should be required as part of undertaking those activities. And as I mentioned, we encourage feedback on these transitional provisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dom, and thank you to all our panel for that presentation. We hope that provided some further insight into the draft bill and its purpose. We'll now move into the question and answer session portion of this webinar. Just as a reminder, if you've got any questions that you'd like asked of the panel, just feel free to select my name in the drop-down box in the chat and then put your question through and we will seek to get it answered. We've already had quite a few come through, so it'd be great to just jump straight into it if we can. Dom, the first one I'd like to ask for you, could you explain what the key difference is between the current development assessment process and our new proposed two-stage approach with the EIRs and SEOs? And how will we ensure that this doesn't add cost and time for developers?
Yeah, so as I've just mentioned, we don't want the two processes to be significantly different in terms of the risks being addressed and the information being submitted. If anything, we want it to be more efficient than what the original process was in terms of going through the Development Act process. As I mentioned, the key efficiency gains for exploration activities from the standardisation of technical standards and other consultation requirements and environmental assessment requirements. We want those all standardised across the state so that companies aren't needing to do these assessments again and again and can move straight to submitting activity notifications and operational management plans. In terms of moving to the infrastructure licence and building the wind farms, as I mentioned, SEOs are gazetted and can be used by anyone. So again, we don't want duplication of assessments. This really streamlines a lot of the environmental assessment and consultation required. I guess those are the key efficiencies that we see as part of that approvals process. But like I said, we still want to ensure that it's a robust process that manages all the risks, but is not asking for things that are over and above what a company should be doing as part of their due diligence.
Thank you, Dom. Alicia, next question is for you. In its regards to the Indigenous land use agreements that the bill requires, would the department consider a single Indigenous land use agreement for both the feasibility licence stages and the infrastructure licence stages?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's something that's seen, I guess, in other sectors in South Australia, but I think that decision is really for the native title group about what they would like to pursue within the agreement. I think from our conversations that we've had at the South Australian Aboriginal Renewable Energy Forums, there is a wide variety of views on what suits best for the different groups. And so what we've proposed in the legislation is to enable that flexibility. So we're not requiring any one type of ILUA or pathway. We want to make sure that groups have the flexibility to negotiate what they would like with the companies.
Excellent.
And so that could include an ILUA that covers both feasibility and infrastructure stages if that was in their interests.
Excellent, thank you. Alicia, I might stay with you. In regards to activities on pastoral land, the question has come through of what the HRE bill and proposed act means for proponents that may have entered into agreements with pastoral leaseholders and native title holders currently for activities on pastoral land.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the key part, one of the key sort of processes that's being developed for this act is ensuring we have competition for access to these really important resources in South Australia, and that we have the opportunity to look at who is best placed to develop them. The criteria that we will be looking at in those competitive processes will include looking at companies' ability to work with existing landowners and negotiate agreements with them and work collaboratively together. So I think anybody that's been working in that space already, that sort of evidence would go well towards demonstrating their abilities in that area.
Thank you. Richard, the next question is for you. We're in a national and global race to establish a competitive green hydrogen sector. How do you see this Act helping in giving South Australia the advantage it needs to achieve that?
Yeah, well, I think, perhaps as I said in my opening remarks, South Australia is already considered a global leader in renewable energy transformation. And I think when I think on global terms, the fact that we're already at 70% last year renewables, South Australia is going to hit that sort of energy surplus moment sooner than other states in Australia and other regions of the world. And I think that's why it's kind of the thinking here is now leading to this sort of major legislative reform to be an enabler for that sort of renewable energy superpower scenario. So we know there's other parts of the world where they also have great wind and solar resources. There's countries in Southern Africa, Northern Africa, the Middle East, South America, Canada, where they've equally got, great wind, great solar, even parts of Europe, Spain. I think obviously we've got lots of land, we've got low population densities. I think we're a very investable nation, and we are seeing a lot of developer and investor interest in developing large scale projects in Australia. And I think really, yes, we hear lots of talk about subsidies. We hear lots of talk about what the US has done through its Inflation Reduction Act, but we equally know that if time is money, so if projects get tied up in protracted approval processes, all of a sudden the value of the subsidy can be eroded. So I guess we're trying to play to our strengths, which is a rich history of strong regulatory performance in other resource sectors. So I think if we can really apply that to the hydrogen and renewable energy sector, that will create having an efficient and certain regulatory framework that both provides confidence and certainty to investors, developers, and the community. That sort of ticks the ESG box. I mean, we know investors and customers for products and the community. That's really key. So I think I think that will really position South Australia well in the new world.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Dom, next question is for you, and it's about offshore wind. How will the offshore wind elements of the proposed bill tie in with the Commonwealth's offshore wind legislation? And do you see any opportunities to avoid duplication between the frameworks?
Yep. So our offshore wind only really covers state waters. So it covers the Gulfs and also 3 nautical miles from the coast. So in terms of overlapping with the Commonwealth, there really shouldn't be any overlapping in terms of licenses and approvals for those projects. There may be common infrastructure that comes out of that, and we'll definitely be open to progressing that and ensuring that our approvals can accommodate common infrastructure that may move between state and Commonwealth waters. But yeah, in terms of what we can control in terms of our approvals under the minister, it's only in the state waters.
And when you're talking common infrastructure, do you mean transmission infrastructure?
Yeah,
between those projects?
Yeah, that's right. So electricity transmission infrastructure that might be constructed, whether it be at the seabed or above, or in ships and things like that. So that's all. Yeah, whatever even new technologies that might be thought up in the next in the short term, we want that to be covered and common across both acts.
Terrific.
Yeah, I think just adding to that, I think we are interested in making sure that it can be seamless as possible, and they're working closely together with the Commonwealth regulators, and certainly through the Ministerial Council frameworks that's set up. So we have the Energy and Climate Change Ministers Council, and offshore wind is one of the key elements that is addressed through that, with a working group where we work with all other jurisdictions in the Commonwealth on those sorts of matters. So we're certainly active in that space in making sure we can reduce duplication and support projects in that way.
Yep. Terrific. Thank you both. Alicia, sticking with you, does the government intend to consult with local councils and local governments in the design of release areas under that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I think local councils would have a wealth of local knowledge and expertise around land use sensitivities, particularly social impacts of projects, but also benefits that could be derived from these projects too, in terms of how we set up not only what areas are released, but the sorts of criteria that we might like to judge the applications on, and the terms and conditions that should be applied to the licenses. So I think we would be looking to include local councils in the prescribed consultation requirements for release areas.
Excellent, thank you. And we'll stay with you for a moment. Moving across to the freehold aspect of this, what might this new bill mean for freehold landowners?
So I guess one of the things that we heard about during the issues paper consultation was that freehold landowners were interested in more support from government in terms of the regulatory framework in their dealings with companies across the life cycle of the project. We certainly received feedback about some strengthened dispute resolution processes and I guess end of life management, where projects need to be decommissioned and land rehabilitated to pre-existing conditions, and having financial assurance mechanisms to support that. They were definitely key things that we heard about and have been included in the bill. I guess, in all the talk about release areas and government-owned land and providing land tenure, I think it's really important to just be clear that for most of the types of licences, for feasibility, infrastructure research and hydrogen generation licences, freehold landowners need to give the right to access and use the land. That isn't the role of the government. I mean, the exception to that is the non-consensual special enterprise licences that Dom talked about, which would be used in exceptional circumstances where things are of such a major significance that the government needs to consider land access requirements. But, for the vast majority, given that would be just an exceptional circumstance, freehold landowners are able to work with the developers to figure out what they would like to see happen on their land or not, if they would not like to host renewable energy development, and what sort of benefits that might flow from that development for them. I think those are the key ones that I can think of.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of that process of dealing with the freehold landowners, that's a process that occurs currently now, and it works well. We don't really want to meddle with that too much. So we we offer licenses over those bits of land, but in terms of the access to that land, that will be solely governed between the proponent and the owner of the freehold land.
Yeah.
And in terms of the licenses and requirements as part of those licenses, we welcome a lot of your feedback in terms of the decommissioning requirements and in terms of the financial assurance, which we're still working through. We want to have these as powers under the Act, but in terms of what comes out of that, it's going to be risk-based. So we don't want to say that every project needs to put up 100% of the financial liability for decommissioning these projects. That's just something that would be, not something the government wants to do. We want to encourage these projects.
Yeah.
So it would be something risk-based. It might be something small, it might be nothing, it might be something a bit larger, but it will depend on the risk and depend on the proponent. There's also salvage value and things like that can be taken into consideration, and also the reuse of the turbines. So we'll be consulting on all of that in future, and we welcome a lot of the feedback from industry.
Yeah, certainly something the department has a lot of experience in determining those sorts of financial assurance requirements and amounts.
Yeah,
in
the petroleum and mining sectors, we've done this very recently in terms of releasing policies for environmental liability management and financial assurance, and they've really worked well so far in terms of ensuring adequate decommissioning, ensuring the states has coverage in terms of security. And both industry and the government has seen much benefits coming out of that, as it's met a lot of the expectations that the community have on the industry.
Terrific, thank you. Two technical questions for you about the scope of the Act. The first one, does the bill cover transmission that will not be connected to the grid, for example, between a renewable energy source and a hydrogen electrolyser?
Yes, so that is the intention. So we want to cover if there's a fully integrated project where they're generating the renewable energy, be it wind or solar, and it's connected to a hydrogen generation plant via transmission line, then that transmission line will also be covered in that licence. If any part of that project then connects to the grid, that will then need the appropriate Electricity Act licensing and AEMO registration and things like that. So, yes.
Fantastic. And the second question, will standalone batteries be regulated under the proposed Act and the storage project?
Yeah, so that is proposed to be regulated, and only when it's primarily used for the storage of renewable energy, because that's the focus of this Act. The answer is yes, and depending, that battery can be located, doesn't necessarily need to be located on site next to the renewable energy if it's within the licence bounds, or if it's down through a transmission line under the Act, then it can be covered through that as well. So short answer is yes, and it's not just batteries, it's also other forms of energy storage.
Fantastic. Well, we've unfortunately reached the end of our time today with the panel. I hope you will all join me virtually in thanking the panel for their time and presenting on the draft Hydrogen Renewable Energy Bill and answering your questions today. We've had a lot of questions come through that we haven't been able to answer, so we'll consider developing answers for those and producing them on the Your Say page, so people can have answers to their questions. We've had a lot come through that are really, really good and valuable, and a recording of the presentation will also be made available on the Your Say. So consultation on the draft bill will close on Monday the 26th of June at 12 p.m. And we encourage you all to visit the Your Say site and contribute to the development of this legislation.
Oh, sorry.
Contributions can be made via a survey form on the Your Say website with a link on the screen now, or sent directly via email to hre@sa.gov.au. You can also keep an eye out for our team, who will be visiting various regional centres of the state, with times and locations also on the screen now, as well as listed on the Your Say page. And in fact, there's been a couple happening in the last couple of days of this week as well. If you require more information on the draft bill or would like to arrange a meeting with the team, please also feel free to get in touch via email. And finally, thank you all for joining us here today and asking your questions of the panel. We hope you found it valuable and informative, and we look forward to engaging further on the development of this important piece of legislation for the state. Thank you.